If you are over 60 and you eat eggs a few times a week, I need 5 minutes of your attention before you crack open another one. Eggs are not the villain everyone once thought they were. That part of the story you probably already know. But here is what almost nobody talks about. It is not really about whether you eat eggs. It is about how you eat them. The way most people over 60 have been preparing and paring their eggs for decades. The butter, the salt, the bacon on the side, the same 3 eggs every single morning without a second thought. That combination is where the real risk to your heart is hiding. By the end of this video, you are going to know exactly which habits around eggs are worth rethinking, which ones are complete myths you can stop worrying about, and how to keep eating eggs. Because you can, and in most cases you should, in a way that supports your heart instead of working against it. Let's get into it. Before we go further, a quick word on where this information comes from and what it is not. Everything in this video is based on general nutrition research and widely published cardiology and dietary guidance. It is meant to help you think more clearly about your own habits. It is not a diagnosis, and it is not a substitute for a conversation with your doctor or a registered dietitian, especially if you already have heart disease, diabetes, high cholesterol, or you are on medication that affects your cholesterol or blood pressure. Your own blood work, your own history, and your own body matter more than any general video on the internet, including this one. If anything here raises a question about your specific situation, that question belongs in your next appointment, not in the comments section. With that said, let's talk about eggs, because the last 20 years of research on this topic has genuinely shifted, and a lot of people over 60 are still operating on outdated information from the 1980s and 90s. For most of your life, you were probably told that eggs were dangerous because of cholesterol. One egg yolk contains around 185 milligrams of cholesterol, and for decades the advice was simple. Eat less cholesterol and your blood cholesterol will go down and your heart attack risk will go down with it. It sounded logical. It made sense on paper. And it shaped how an entire generation ate breakfast. Here is the problem. That relationship turned out to be far weaker than anyone assumed. For most people, dietary cholesterol, the cholesterol you actually eat, has a much smaller effect on blood cholesterol than saturated fat and trans fat do. Your liver produces the majority of the cholesterol circulating in your bloodstream, regardless of how many eggs you eat. And for most people, the liver adjusts its own production up or down to compensate for what comes in through food. This is why large nutrition reviews over the past 15 to 20 years have walked back a lot of the old alarm around eggs specifically. In 2015, U.S. dietary guidelines actually removed the long-standing daily limit on dietary cholesterol, in large part because the science no longer supported treating it as the primary driver of heart disease for the general population. So does that mean eggs get a complete free pass? Not quite, and this is the part that matters most for anyone over 60. There is a subset of people, researchers sometimes call them hyperresponders, whose blood cholesterol does rise more noticeably when they eat cholesterol-rich foods like eggs. And separately, some research has found associations between higher egg consumption and cardiovascular risk in people who already have type 2 diabetes, or in populations eating a diet that is generally high in saturated fat and processed food alongside the eggs. The honest answer is that eggs, on their own, in a generally healthy diet, are not the dietary villain they were made out to be. But eggs eaten as part of a pattern, a particular way, a particular frequency alongside particular other foods can absolutely be a problem. And that pattern is exactly what tends to show up more and more as people move into their 60s, 70s, and beyond. That is the real subject of this video. Not should you eat eggs, but are you eating them in a way that is quietly working against your heart? Here is something that does not get said often enough. The exact same plate of food can carry a different level of risk at 65 than it did at 35. That is not fear-mongering, it is just physiology. As we age, a few things commonly shift. Blood vessels tend to lose some elasticity, which is part of why blood pressure often creeps upward over the decades. The way the body processes fats and sugars can change, which is part of why type 2 diabetes and prediabetes become more common after 60. Many people are also managing at least one chronic condition by this stage: high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, or a combination, and are often taking one or more medications for it. Physical activity levels, for very understandable reasons, like joint pain or reduced mobility, also tend to decline for a lot of people in this age group, which affects how efficiently the body handles dietary fat and cholesterol. None of this means your body has turned against you. It means the margin for error on daily habits gets a little slimmer, and small, repeated choices matter more than they used to. A 35-year-old who fries 3 eggs in a generous pat of butter every morning next to 2 strips of bacon has some cardiovascular cushion working in their favor: youth, faster metabolism, more resilient blood vessels. A 68-year-old doing the exact same thing every morning for years is asking a less flexible cardiovascular system to absorb the exact same habit day after day on top of whatever else is already going on with their blood pressure or their arteries. This is not a reason to panic about eggs. It is a reason to get specific about the habits surrounding them. So let's walk through the mistakes that actually matter, the ones we see over and over again in how people over 60 eat their eggs. This is the single biggest issue we see, and it has almost nothing to do with the egg itself. A lot of people fry their eggs in a generous amount of butter, or worse, in the leftover grease from bacon or sausage in the same pan. It is a habit that goes back generations, and it tastes good. Nobody is denying that. But butter and bacon fat are both high in saturated fat, and saturated fat is one of the most well-established dietary drivers of higher LDL cholesterol, the type most closely linked to plaque buildup in the arteries. When you cook an egg, which on its own contributes a modest, manageable amount of dietary cholesterol, in a pool of saturated fat, you are stacking 2 cardiovascular pressures on top of each other in a single bite. The egg was never really the problem. The cooking method turned it into one. The fix here is not to eat your eggs dry and flavorless. It is to change what they are cooked in. A small amount of olive oil, which is mostly unsaturated fat, is a straightforward swap that keeps the texture and flavor most people want while meaningfully reducing the saturated fat load. Avocado oil works the same way. Even a non-stick pan with a light spray of oil or a small teaspoon of butter instead of a heaping tablespoon makes a real difference over months and years of daily use. This is not about eliminating flavor. It is about portion and source. 1 teaspoon of olive oil in a hot pan gets you the same golden, slightly crisp egg white you are used to without nearly the same saturated fat hit. If you genuinely love the taste of butter, you do not have to swear it off completely. A small pat, not a melting pool that the egg sits in, changes the math significantly. It is the difference between a splash of flavor and a bath of saturated fat. If mistake number 1 is about what the eggs are cooked in, mistake number 2 is about what sits next to them on the plate. Bacon, breakfast sausage, and ham are the classic partners to a plate of eggs, and this is one of the most common breakfast patterns among people over 60, often because it is what breakfast has always looked like. The issue is that processed meats like bacon and sausage are typically very high in sodium and saturated fat, and bacon specifically is classified by major health organizations as a processed meat with links to increased cardiovascular risk when consumed regularly. A typical serving of bacon can carry several hundred milligrams of sodium on its own. And when you add that to the salt already in the eggs, the toast, and anything else on the plate, a single breakfast can quietly account for a third or more of a full day's recommended sodium intake. For people managing high blood pressure, which describes a very large share of adults over 60, sodium is one of the most direct levers on blood pressure control, and blood pressure is one of the most direct levers on heart attack and stroke risk. This is not a small, abstract connection. It is one of the more well-documented relationships in cardiovascular health. This does not mean bacon has to disappear from your life forever. It means frequency and portion matter enormously. Having 2 strips of bacon as an occasional treat is a very different pattern than having bacon or sausage every single morning as the default. If you want that smoky, salty, savory flavor daily, there are lower sodium alternatives worth trying. Turkey bacon, which typically runs lower in saturated fat and sometimes lower in sodium depending on the brand, or simply swapping in vegetables, sauteed spinach, mushrooms, or tomatoes for the meat most days, and saving the bacon for once or twice a week rather than 7 days a week. The habit to notice here is not eggs are dangerous. It is the daily default pairing I've had for 30 years might be worth revisiting. This one sneaks up on people because it happens in small, repeated actions rather than one obvious decision. A shake of salt on the eggs. A pinch more because the first shake did not feel like enough. Salted butter used for cooking. A side of ham or bacon that is already salted before it even hits the plate. Toast with salted butter on top of that. None of these individual choices feel significant in the moment, but sodium adds up fast, and most people significantly underestimate how much they are consuming in a single meal because they are only counting the salt they can see themselves adding, not the sodium that is already built into processed and pre-seasoned foods. For someone over 60 managing blood pressure, this steady accumulation matters. The current general guidance from most major health organizations recommends keeping total daily sodium under roughly 200-300 milligrams, and for many people with high blood pressure specifically, doctors often recommend aiming closer to WIT 500 milligrams. A single indulgent breakfast, salted eggs, salted butter, a couple strips of bacon, buttered toast, can realistically use up half of that lower target before lunch even happens. The fix is not to eat bland food for the rest of your life. It is awareness and substitution. Herbs and spices, black pepper, paprika, garlic powder, chives, a little hot sauce can add a lot of flavor to eggs without adding sodium. Tasting before you automatically reach for the salt shaker, rather than salting out of habit, is a small pause that adds up over hundreds of breakfasts a year. And being mindful that if bacon or ham is already on the plate, the eggs themselves may not need any added salt at all because you are already getting plenty from what is next to them. This is less about any one egg and more about the pattern of eating a lot of the same thing the same way every single day indefinitely. Some people over 60 have settled into a routine of 3 or 4 whole eggs cooked the same way every single morning because it is simple, it is filling, and it has always worked for them. There is nothing inherently wrong with eggs being a regular part of your diet. For most healthy adults, current research supports up to about 1 egg a day, and some guidance allows more as being perfectly reasonable within an otherwise balanced diet. The concern is less about hitting some fixed number and more about the fact that a large identical portion every single day, especially when it is not balanced with much variety elsewhere, tends to correlate with less overall dietary variety. And dietary variety is one of the underappreciated pillars of heart health. If eggs are the anchor of breakfast every day, ask yourself what else is on the plate across the rest of your meals. Are you getting a range of vegetables, whole grains, fruit, fish, legumes, and nuts across the week, or has breakfast become such a fixed, comfortable ritual that it has quietly crowded out other sources of nutrition? For people managing existing cholesterol concerns specifically, research on egg consumption tends to look most favorable when eggs are eaten as part of a diet that is otherwise rich in fiber, vegetables, and unsaturated fats, and least favorable when eggs are eaten alongside a generally high saturated fat, low fiber diet. In other words, the eggs are not operating in isolation. They are operating in the context of everything else you eat that day and that week. A simple, practical guideline that many cardiologists and dietitians suggest for people over 60, particularly those with elevated cholesterol or existing heart disease, is to think in terms of a weekly average rather than a rigid daily rule. For example, keeping whole eggs to somewhere in the range of 4 to 7 per week, depending on your individual cholesterol profile and your doctor's guidance. While using egg whites, which contain no cholesterol at all, more freely on the days when you want the protein without the yolk. This might be the most important mistake on this entire list because it is the one that turns a general guideline into personal risk. Eggs affect different people differently, and this is not vague reassurance. It is directly supported by research on hyperresponders and by studies specifically looking at people with type 2 diabetes. If you have type 2 diabetes, some research suggests egg consumption may be associated with a somewhat higher cardiovascular risk compared to people without diabetes eating the same amount. If you already have elevated LDL cholesterol, existing heart disease, a family history of early heart attacks, or you have been told by a doctor that you are cholesterol sensitive, the general eggs are basically fine for most people. Reassurance applies to you less directly than it does to someone with a clean cardiovascular history. The mistake is not eating eggs despite one of these conditions. The mistake is eating them exactly the same way you always have without ever revisiting that habit in light of a diagnosis that came later in life. A lot of people over 60 received a cholesterol or blood pressure diagnosis at some point in their 60s or 70s and simply kept every other habit exactly the same, assuming the medication would handle the rest. Medication can do a great deal, but it works best alongside dietary awareness, not as a replacement for it. If you fall into one of these higher sensitivity categories, this is genuinely a conversation worth having directly with your doctor or a dietitian, because they can look at your actual LDL numbers, your triglycerides, your blood sugar control, and your medication list and give you a specific personalized number and approach rather than a general rule pulled from population level research. This video can tell you what tends to be true on average. It cannot tell you what is true for your specific blood work. Here's a small shift that has an outsized effect and gets almost no attention. Eggs, on their own, contain essentially no fiber. Fiber is one of the most consistently supported nutrients for heart health because soluble fiber in particular helps bind to cholesterol in the digestive system and can help lower LDL cholesterol over time. When eggs are eaten completely on their own or alongside white toast and not much else, you are missing an easy opportunity to offset some of the cholesterol and fat in the meal with something that actively works in your favor. The fix is genuinely simple and does not require giving anything up. Add a handful of spinach or a few slices of tomato into a scramble or omelet. Serve eggs over a bed of sautéed vegetables instead of alongside plain toast. Swap white toast for a slice of whole grain bread, which carries meaningfully more fiber than refined white bread. Add half an avocado on the side, which brings fiber along with heart-healthy unsaturated fat. None of these changes require eating less of what you enjoy. They simply build a more balanced plate around the eggs you were already going to eat. This one habit, consistently pairing eggs with a source of fiber, is one of the easiest, most sustainable changes on this entire list because it does not ask you to eat less or change your cooking method. It just asks you to add something. Let's bring this together into something you can actually use for most healthy adults over 60 without diabetes or existing heart disease. Current mainstream guidance generally supports up to about 1 whole egg a day or roughly 7 a week as part of an otherwise balanced diet, with many nutrition organizations noting this can flex higher for people with well-managed cholesterol. For people with type 2 diabetes, existing heart disease, or elevated LDL cholesterol, many cardiologists and dietitians suggest being more conservative, often somewhere around 3 to 4 whole eggs a week, while using egg whites more freely, since egg whites carry the protein without any of the cholesterol found in the yolk. These are general ranges, not prescriptions. The single most useful thing you can do with this information is bring it to your next doctor's visit and ask directly, given my cholesterol numbers and my other conditions, how many eggs a week is reasonable for me, and does the way I usually cook them matter? That 5-minute conversation will give you a far more precise answer than any general video, including this one, ever could. So let's recap, because none of this is about giving up something you enjoy. It is about a handful of small adjustments that add up. Cook your eggs in a small amount of olive oil or avocado oil instead of a generous pool of butter or leftover bacon grease. Rethink the daily processed meat pairing. Save bacon and sausage for occasional treats rather than a daily default, and lean on turkey bacon or sautéed vegetables the rest of the time. Season with herbs and spices instead of reaching for the salt shaker out of habit. And remember that if there's already meat on the plate, you likely need less added salt than you think. Think in terms of a weekly average rather than a rigid daily number, and don't let eggs crowd out variety in the rest of your diet. If you have diabetes, existing heart disease, or known high cholesterol, treat the general guidelines as a starting point for a conversation with your doctor, not a final answer. And finally, get in the habit of pairing your eggs with something that contains fiber, vegetables, whole grain toast, or avocado, so the meal is working for your heart from more than one direction at once. None of this requires eliminating eggs from your life. For the vast majority of people, even people over 60, eggs remain a genuinely good source of high-quality protein, vitamin D, B12, choline, and several other nutrients that become more important, not less, as we age. The goal was never to scare you away from them. The goal was to help you see the habits sitting quietly around the egg, the butter, the bacon, the salt, the same routine repeated for 20 years without a second look. Because those habits, not the egg itself, are usually where the real opportunity for a heart healthier plate is hiding. If this video gave you something worth thinking about the next time you crack open a carton, that is exactly what it was made for. If you have already made some of these swaps, maybe you switched to olive oil years ago, or you already save bacon for weekends only. Let us know in the comments, because hearing what has actually worked for other people your age is often more useful than hearing it from us. If you found this helpful, give it a like, share it with someone who could use a gentle nudge on their breakfast habits, and subscribe if you would like more honest, research-based breakdowns like this one. We have more videos coming on the everyday habits that quietly affect heart health after 60, and we would love to have you back for those. As always, this video is general information, not personal medical advice. If anything here raised a question specific to your own health, bring it to your doctor. They know your numbers. We don't. See you in the next one.